So today we are going to get in and we are going to have a mission report about recently myself, Emma Stevens and Michelle Quinn went to the island of Bequia. And I'm going to tell you about that in just a moment. But leading up into that, let's open up God's Word just a little bit. And I want to challenge you with a word. What do you think about first when you hear the word desire? Desire. Is it a good thing or a bad thing? I grew up in the time where music was very influential to me in the 80s and through the 90s. And so when I hear that, immediately I hear Bono singing the song Desire, and he gives that, yeah, at the beginning of it. First thing pops in my head. You may go back to some of those books that you know you shouldn't be reading by Danielle Steele or any of those other people and think, oh yeah, that desire. And I'm looking to see who's guilty right now. It's a word that packs a lot of punch, desire. But it's not always a bad thing. It can be, but not always. The truth is, our desires that we possess could be our deepest passions. It could be the things that drive us and moves us towards God or away from God. God is very interested in your desires. And it's healthy for us to stop. Take stock and go, what are the things that I desire, that I am passionate about, that are going to move me through my life? There's negative examples in the Bible for sure. Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 3 says, among whom also we all once conducted ourselves in the lusts of the flesh, fulfilling the desires of the flesh and mind, and were by nature children of wrath, just as the others. Colossians 3 and verse 5 says, therefore put to death your members, which are on the earth, fornication, uncleanness, passion, evil desire, and covetousness, which is idolatry. And Galatians 5:24 tells us that there can be a shift in those. We can put those things to death. Those things that did enamor us and seem glamorous to us, that we grabbed a hold of and we put our desires in the wicked things of the world, they can be conquered. Galatians 5:24 and says, those who are Christ have crucified the flesh with its passions and its desires. There are godly desires as well. And those are the things that as Christians we must pursue. Our passions must be built around godly desires. So much so that it drives us and it increases our enthusiasm, that we can see the joy that we have in life because of the godly things that we desire. When they are fed, when they are nurtured, when they are pursued, they will produce godly lives. It's necessary. It's very good to pursue the qualities of God to develop in your life. And you see these desires that God has given us in the Scriptures. You're mindful of it. Peter tells us in 1 Peter 2:2, he says, therefore, laying aside all malice, all deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and all evil speaking, as newborn babes, desire the pure milk of the word, that you may grow thereby, if indeed you have tasted that the Lord is gracious. It is a good thing to desire the word and spend time in it. In 1 Thessalonians 2:17, Paul says, but we, brethren, have been taken away from you for a short time in presence, not in heart, endeavored more eagerly to see your face with great desire. We can relate to that. You ever been separated from a Christian for some point, and then you get to see them again, and you have that desire, and you're just bubbling over? We'll see that in the mission work that we go for here in just a second. Paul also writes in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, and I think this one's particularly interesting because in the setup to this, that he's going to talk about desire real briefly, he's been talking to them about the spiritual gifts and the various ones that they would possess and how to deal with those. And in verse 29 of chapter 12, 1 Corinthians, he says, are all apostles, are all prophets, are all teachers, are all workers of miracles? Do all have the gifts of healing? Do all speak with tongues? Do all interpret? But earnestly desire the best gifts, and yet I show you a more excellent way. And then he transitions into chapter 13, that amazing chapter on love, and all the qualities of love, godly love, that we must possess, that we must truly live out and give into the world. And finally, in terms of godly desires, think to Revelation chapter 22. Jesus is speaking, and he says, "Behold, I am coming quickly, and my reward is with me to give to everyone according to his work," in verse 12. But if you jump on down to verse 17, he says, "And the Spirit and the bride say, Come. And let him who hears say, Come. And let him who thirsts come. Whoever desires, let him take the water of life freely." Whoever desires. It means Christianity and salvation and a life with God is something that is available to every single person. We are allowed, we must desire that. God put those words in there so that we could. God gave us his words to provide the way for us and to have the knowledge to desire it and to be driven to do so. So I think as we go into this and we talk about mission work, I want you to think about the ways that godly desires work and worldly desires work, because the two clash. At some point, you've had that clash in your life where you want to do what's right. You're wanting to pursue God with great passion and enthusiasm and to drive home and do things. And maybe it's not even something super epic. Maybe you've set a goal where you want to read your Bible every day, but you are struggling with that because sometimes you find it easier for the excuses to come in, and it's easier to put your Bible aside a little bit more. And there's a push and a pull that goes on with your desires. The thing about those desires is that they're cultivated. They have to be developed, and they have to fill your heart. When God is your desire, when God is your purpose, when God is your passion, then God has your heart. If God has your heart, then whatever thoughts you have will come out of your heart. They'll be godly. Whatever actions you do that come out of your heart, a heart of God, will be godly actions. Whatever purpose you find will be a godly purpose, and this is the way God created us to be, to desire him, to be with him, to desire his qualities. Let God have our hearts. Let our hearts be filled with him. It's a matter of perspective. You can look in one side of your life and focus on all those ungodly desires. You could pursue those, but you could shift your perspective. Focus on God, have a life filled with God, and see the beauty, the joy, the freedom, and the richness that comes out of being a Christian. Let's think about that as we go through this mission report. So, in the late part of May 28th through June 6th, the three of us, Michelle, Emma, and I, went to the island of Bequia. And you may be saying, what is Bequia? Well, it's this very, very, very small island in the Caribbean. In fact, more specifically, it's near St. Vincent and the Grenadine Islands. I had never heard of Bequia, and I think most of us had never heard of it until it became a possible place for a mission trip. And you can see there St. Vincent, which is pretty far down, and Bequia is the tiny island underneath it. I do say tiny because it is a whopping 7 square miles. 7 square miles, and has a population of about 5,000 to 6,000 people. So it is a small island, but it was also a pretty amazing island. It did make it a little challenging to get there. We flew from Nashville. We got up at 3 in the morning, jumped on a plane in Nashville, flew down to Miami. From Miami, we jumped on a flight to Barbados, and in Barbados, we got on this tiny plane, which was super get to know your friends sort of moment there. You're packed in pretty tight, and we flew over for about 45 minutes to the island of Bequia. And you would see these tiny islands as you would go as well, uninhabited, and you're like, what could happen there? It was pretty beautiful in doing so. Thank you very much. I forgot to give you the code. That should help you see a little bit. But Bequia was a beautiful island. The vegetation was beautiful. The trees, I don't even know what they are. They were amazing. And so there was a lot of beautiful things to see in the island. There were some of the views where you would get lost, and we were lost at this particular point. And we ended up on this hillside looking out, and you're like, oh my goodness. You just turn a corner, and there is incredible beauty to be found. It doesn't seem real. How could we not have heard of this place that existed? This was literally across the road from the hotel that we stayed in. We walk less than 100 feet, and that is a view that you get, and you're like, this is truly something, a glory to God for creating such an amazing thing. And then there's a goat on top of it. And these goats would run around freely, and some of them, my favorite, were the goats that had the rope around their neck, and you could see the stake, the steel stake that they were supposed to hold them in the ground, dragging along behind them. That was fun. And this dog was this cute little dog, and it would growl as I walked by a little bit. And sometimes you dealt with them. The dogs on this island happened to be healthier than any dog I've seen on any island before. Most were okay, but there was one particular dog where Michelle and I were walking down the road, didn't see it. It was in a shed. We could hear the growl. And Michelle goes, nope. And we walk on. I was in total agreement with her. We're not going to fight that dog at all. And this is the downtown area, and you can see that there's quite a bit of vegetation, and it looks truly like a very, very special place indeed. Our group was made up of 17 people from the States, and you can see them with our shirts. And we came from about 5 different congregations throughout Indiana and Kentucky, Tennessee, maybe Alabama as well. And most of the people in this group had all been on mission trips before. There was 3 that it was their first time on a mission trip and first time out of the States. So that was pretty exciting for them as well. Our group that we go with usually is in the 30s, but this island, because of its size and because of the difficulty in getting there, we had to restrict the group. That small plane we took had to be chartered to get over there, so we couldn't have more than 17 people actually go with us. Michelle wrote, and this was her comment about the island itself, Bequia was my 4th and best by far Caribbean mission trip. The island is beautiful. The people are warm and welcoming, and the truth of God's word was shared throughout the island. It was amazing. Those are true words. It was beautiful, and the people were that way. This is our hotel. It's an interesting place because it looks like, I don't know. I don't think I would have chosen such a place, but it worked. The room that myself and Brian Egerton stayed in with Nick Debris from Bowling Green was maybe 200 square feet with 3 beds crammed in. We had to move stuff to put our luggage in there. This was nothing fancy. In fact, one day there was no water at all, and so it was raining, so I just went out and stuck my head under the gutter and thought, I told Mom this, those years in Eastern Kentucky paid off. Totally know how to deal with that situation. Your Wi-Fi was really iffy if it came, but luggage didn't show up, but you learn it doesn't matter. We'll get by. You'll totally get by. In fact, when our luggage did show up, I started wondering how many days I could have gone without it. So I pushed it aside a little bit. I had 2 extra clothes, so it wasn't totally filthy, but it was okay. Just go buy a toothbrush. You're okay. So this is where we stayed, and the staff there was very accommodating, extremely friendly. It was also super, super inexpensive compared to a lot of the other parts of the Caribbean. So it was a great place to stay. You would go to these other places where we'd go and eat, and this was the Pirates Cove, I believe is what this was called, and it was a real character. And he, of course, told us the celebrities that he had met, and then he tried to sell us real estate, and we tried to invite him to church, and then we found out that wasn't his interest. But he actually came, and that was awesome. But this was a good example of perspective. You can see behind Michelle and I can't tell if it's Rachel or Laurel from this photo, but behind them is this just beautiful blue ocean, and these boats are back there, and it's just a truly spectacular sight. But if you shift your head just a little bit, you realize you're next to a parking lot where there's junk piled up, and there's cars that may work and may not work, and there's trash there. It's just a question of which way you turn your head and where you put your focus. This was truly a beautiful island, but like anywhere and like in any place in our lives, it is truly a question of perspective. Where do you put your face? Is it towards God, or is it towards the ungodly desires? But I'll give you an aerial view here so you can see that this was the dry season. So it was a lot of browns. The rainfall was very small up until this point. We got there at the beginning of the hurricane season, and so it's starting to pick up a little bit more of the rain that was so vital to the island. That's their only source of water in terms of showers and just plumbing and that sort of things. It's only through the rain. There's no rivers on the island. There's no lakes. It's strictly dependent on rainfall, and because of that, you have to be prepared to ration the water out and be very mindful respectful of how you use it. So all those things that we were taught when we were younger, don't leave your faucet on, take quick showers, just being respectful of where you are and adjusting to how they live is necessary because of that situation. That's where the church building was in the flyover, and you can see it's pretty close to the shore. We worked with a congregation called the La Pompe Church of Christ, and La Pompe Church of Christ was pretty interesting to us because they don't have a full-time minister at the moment. They rotate. So St. Vincent's pretty close, and so 4 of the men from St. Vincent will come over each at a different weekend, and they will fly over, they will do the preaching, and then they'll go back to St. Vincent. Mark Charles was the minister that we worked with, and he also works at an insurance company, but his great desire is to work full-time as a minister. And he has every quality he needs for that. He's very skilled in the Word. He has a tremendous personality. And he's a man that has vision and is willing to carry out that vision. It was so evident in everything that he did. If you pay close attention to the sign here, you'll notice that Sundays it's 9 a.m. Bible study, 10 a.m. worship. Thursdays is when they have their weekly Bible study at 6:30. And Saturdays, the third Saturday of every month, 4:30, there's a youth meeting. This is Mark's week to come over. Some of the other guys only come over Sunday morning, they preach and they go back. Mark comes over Friday, works with the youth at 4:30 on Saturday, goes out and meets people, then does his preaching, and then goes back to his job on the other island. The guy's a worker, so it was a pleasure to be there with him. This is a congregation that when we first attended, we noticed on the attendance it said last week 8 people, previous week 15 people. So this is a small congregation. They needed an evangelism campaign for sure. This is during the youth day that we had, and there were some real characters of kids there, great kids. This was Mark's son, Prince. He's 6. Prince is a great name, super fun kid, very expressive. So I started asking him, what would it look like if you saw the scariest thing in the world? He gave me that face. What would it look like if you had the most tasty meal your mom's ever made? He gave me this face. What would it look like if you saw your true love of your entire life? He gave me that face. There's fun people. And so this was the youth event that took place, and Mark would quiz them, books of the Bible, some facts about the Bible. We played some games with them where they had to draw pictures on their heads as I described a scene to them. This is Mark with one of the young Christians there. This is Kiefer. He's 12, I think, 11 or 12, and he's doing the books of the Bible, and we challenged him to say them backwards and all that kind of fun stuff. But this is the congregation, this is the church building, and you can see that they've got Church of Christ written on the top of the roof because it's set down deep off the road, and you can see how beautiful it is next to the church building there for certain. And I always wondered, how long is it before you take that view for granted? It takes more than 10 days because I really enjoyed that. And you can see here the steps that you would walk down to get to the church building for services. These steps were not the same length. They were not the same height. So you were adjusting as you go up and down them for sure. But it wasn't really that bad. Some of the older people said this was in fact challenging. So that's something to address in the future. This is the interior, and this is during the worship service. One of the other ministers had also come over from St. Vincent, and he was leading the singing. Brian Egerton led the Lord's Supper, and this is interesting. You can see that without hesitation, they used the 11 and 12 and 13-year-old age group quickly to serve the table, to lead the prayers. The mindset there is if you're a Christian, you're diving in. You will be working. And so we saw these young men quite a bit, and they would come out each night to the services, and they were very helpful. There was not a sense of, oh, we're a child, we'll wait for our time eventually. It was, I'm a Christian, I'll be working now. So that was very encouraging to participate in that. As we went out throughout the week, we would go door knocking, and we would invite people obviously to come to our services, and we would also invite them to a Bible study. We'd give them these two materials for certain, and maybe a series of pamphlets. The yellow one is the information for the meeting times and contact information, and then information about the church on the back. The Way to Life is a Bible study series where we put phone numbers that they could complete each lesson, and then they could call the preacher and he could follow up with a contact after that to keep the communication going between all the people that we would talk to. It was interesting how receptive people were to this material. It was interesting how many people would come up and say, "Do you have an extra so I can give it to my friend?" We may find here in the States that people might be a little more reluctant to take that stuff. But these people were like, "Give me, give me, give me. I will read this. I will look at this. I will do this." And it seemed like they weren't just being polite, most of them. This is a neighborhood. Michelle and I were walking in, and you can see how hilly. The photos do not do it justice. These were very, very steep hills to walk up and down. And you would just talk to anybody that you could find, anybody that would answer the door. You would approach them and talk to them. You can kind of get a sense of how the houses are built. And we are just finding any person we can to speak to them about Jesus, to see if they needed a prayer. We would do it. And sometimes the houses were pretty close. Sometimes they were a little bit more spread out. But it was always very hilly unless you stayed downtown. This is Port Elizabeth, and this is the main town section here. There's only one gas station. There's a couple of tiny, tiny little grocery stores and one bigger one called Knight's. The costs there were incredible for some things. Like I said, they forgot my luggage, so I had to buy a toothbrush, toothpaste, and deodorant, and I think that cost me like $12, $13 US. I was like, ouch. Maybe I'll get a stick. I don't know. Clean my teeth that way. That's $1. But here, we would just encounter people as they walked by. And this was a fun spot in particular because they would some people would ignore it a little bit, but most people took it, and most people wanted to know more. And we even had a police officer at one point walk up, and he was from a different religious group entirely, and he wanted to discuss their beliefs with some of the young people on the trip, but he was so respectful in the way he did it, and I thought that was a commendation to him. And then he came up to me afterwards and said, "Well, I've spoke to young people. I know you do believe things that are different, but I'm so glad you're on our island. I'm so glad that you're here teaching about Jesus." I said, "But we're not going to teach your beliefs. But I'm so glad that you're here teaching the Bible. Thank you for doing that. Our island does not get the attention that we need it to have, and we need more Jesus on our island." So the idea that they were welcoming us in that way was a big benefit as well. Even the men from the tourism board came out and thanked us for setting up a tent and setting up speakers and teaching the Bible loudly late at night. They thanked us for doing that. So that was pretty encouraging as well. This is a house that we had Bible study at a couple times. I wanted to show you the cisterns, the way they would capture their water from the rain, and this would be the source of their water that they would use in their house. This is the porch of the house. This is the door that we first knocked on, and that is the baby, the cute baby that lived at the house, and that's Hannah Van Winkle, who was with us on the trip, and they passed the baby around, of course. It was cute. But we were also able to study with the mother of the baby, and it was pretty amazing, the reception that you had. Now, I'm only giving you pictures primarily from my car and a couple of others. We broke up into 4 different cars in our group and went to different areas to make sure we could cover the island as thoroughly as possible. So I'm documenting mostly what took place in my car. And so we had a Bible study with them, trying to lead them to the church, trying to lead them to draw closer to the Lord because there was a need for it. And they would acknowledge that. And there was good reception for it for certain. This was a lady, Eloise, who lived on an incredibly steep hill, and she asked us to come back. And when we did, it was an interesting situation because in her realization, she had nothing to do with any church whatsoever until she was 50 years old. And she led a pretty wild life. She would admit this to us. And what she came to realize while we were sitting there with her is that her son has gone to worldliness. And the grief that she was channeling because she knew she was somewhat responsible for leading him in that direction. She had been that example for 50 years, and he had picked up those habits. And the grief that hit her was so strong that she began crying. She became overcome with emotions, and she just needs someone to listen to her, just someone to pray with her. And she had been looking for anything. And so it was quite emotional, what she was experiencing, but it was very, very real. And when she was crying, those tears were pouring out of her eyes. And that was a moment where you're like, this is a good thing that we're here. God is good because we're able to connect with people and we are able to help them see Jesus a little clearer. And then there is a reality to this. It's not about clicking down numbers of anything. This is about people truly needing Jesus in their life and people truly turning to God as the answer for their lives. And she was really doing that. So we were able to get her information and connect the preacher to go visit her son and try to help her in this particular regard. We spent quite a bit of time with her, and she was so gracious in that moment. But these are very, very real people that very much needed to hear the Lord's message and hear the gospel for sure. But in the midst of meeting so many people, what was really surprising to us is that we kept meeting people who said, I used to be a member of the Church of Christ. I used to go to that church. And that became a little stunning. What do you mean you used to? What's that? And we come to find out that Mark had a list of people who did go at some particular point, and he had a few of those names, but we kept encountering more and more and more people. That's why Emma, she gave this quote. We quickly realized that our purpose here was different. Though we still told everyone within earshot about Jesus, our goal became to encourage the Christians and remind them that what they were doing is not in vain and that they are not in alone. The second part of what we were doing, aside from going out and teaching, was to build up the local Christians and pull errant members back to the church. They had drifted. Apparently, the congregation had been of a substantial size at one point relative to the Caribbean. The minister died, and people just drifted and drifted. And so that became a new task. Sometimes on mission trips, you just have to stick with your plan, and sometimes you put that plan aside a little bit and adapt. And there was very much a need to adapt and start looking for these members to bring them back and strengthen the church as a whole. We also strengthened the church because sometimes it would be discouraging. 8 members, 15 members showing up for worship. And then it was so encouraging that the day we had our worship on Sunday, there was 50 people in attendance. We made up 17 of those, but even if you look at 33 compared to 8, that's a big jump. And for people to see others that they hadn't seen in the past, that's a big deal. And so there was a lot of encouragement that was going on within that scope. Now, the other way we were reaching out to people was to set up, and we had an old school tent meeting. And I mean in the old school way, the open-walled tents where there's going to be a covering. We are in the midst of downtown. We are right in the middle of the port. This is the most popular place that we could be. In fact, when we would tell people, they'd say, where is it? We'd say, it's under the almond tree. Oh, the almond tree. Yes, the almond tree. I will be at the almond tree. Literally, that was how we would describe the place. And so there, the almond tree is where we're sitting. We brought in, because of the island, the situation of it, a lot of things had to be rented and brought in on a ferry. And so the chairs were brought in on the ferry, and then the tent was set up. It was just a 20-foot by 20-foot tent that would protect you from rain if it did rain, and definitely the birds that were flying around as well. And when it was all said and done, this is what we ended up with, and this would be our meeting place. During the daytime, Lori and Daryl Debris would set up, and Lori's a nurse, so she would also give free blood pressure readings. They would give free reading glasses, and they would set up Bible studies with people through that as they showed up. She would also do this at night after each service as well. And then Glenn Head, who preaches in Paducah, he just came up with the idea, and he just stayed down there and used the microphone and the speakers and preached the book of Acts throughout the week. And hours and hours and hours he would preach. And his goal was to get through the whole book of Acts before the end of the trip. He was a machine and got that accomplished. And you can see some people in the background that would wander over, come down and sit and listen. And there were several times I would come up to people and was like, oh, we heard your buddy preaching down there. And I just pulled my car over and sat and listened to him for a while. So people were responding. There's some part of this where I had to go, do they think we're crazy? that we are making so much noise? Do they think we're crazy? And some of them, maybe. There were some tourist people that were from the boats, and they kind of stopped and stared for a little bit. There were some curious looks by the people that would walk by with their drinks and whatever. But for the most part, people were super respectful, and they would come and listen. This is the speaker setup. You can see the technology was a little bit different. Wires were going everywhere. This was our sound booth, which was just a laptop, some questionable converters and plugs going into things. It worked most of the time. And then we just turned the lights on and went. This was the only lighting. I love this picture because it gives you some sense of what it was like. They put the lights behind the preacher, so I guess he could see his notes and see the audience, but that meant he was backlit, so they were generally hard to see overall. But if you turn your head just a little bit, you can look out into that background and you can see the Caribbean Sea, the cool bay, and a beautiful sunset. It was a lot. It's just a question of where you're willing to look at things as well. Here's Brian preaching a little bit. There's me preaching. You can see my big old head up there moving along. And you can see even some people in the background here that would just sit on the side a little bit. This is Mark here. This is Tom Hall. He preaches in Bowling Green. And I'm going to bring this picture up because it was the first time we've ever had a meeting where disturbances occurred. Never had one when someone comes up and tries to disrupt your meeting. The first one was the oddest thing I'd ever seen at a church meeting. I'm not going to say oddest thing ever, but this guy comes up and he starts interrupting as we're singing. We're gathering up and we're singing. And as we're doing that, he goes, hey. We just keep singing. We're just going to see what the locals do because this is not our territory. We'll see what they do. Hey, he says, don't do anything. He then proceeds to come over and he sits down in the middle of the chairs that are set up. This I had never seen. I will do my best. He reaches over and he starts drawing in the ground some weird symbols. And then he turns his hands this. If this is live stream, you're really going to love this. And he is doing these signs like this a little bit. We're like, what is happening? Hey, he gets up. Then he gets up and wanders over and he starts writing in the ground big things again. And I was like, I think he's putting a curse on us. I can't tell what's happening. Thankfully, one of the members there used to be a police officer. And this was a beautiful thing to see. There's so many ways you could have handled that situation, but this was as a Christian would do it. So they gently walk over to him, touch him on the shoulder just a little bit and says, come with me. And he starts to mouth something, but they're like, no, just come with me. And it was kindly done, where he was taken away and he was no longer a disruption. That could have gone so many different ways. I don't know. But just in case, I went and moved my foot through all the scribbling. You ain't cursing us, buddy. Played that game before. Second night was this guy, the second disruption. And he just kept trying to interrupt and yelling out and yelling out and yelling out. How many months are in a year? We didn't pay attention. How many months are in a year? We're not paying attention. How many months are in a year? Hey. And then finally someone goes, 12. No, there can't be. And we're like, we're done. But again, this was a great moment where you see Christians handling a situation where it could have gone so many different ways. It might be normal for you to get a little bit anxious about this. What's this guy going to do, right? But instead, the church, they started doing their amens a little bit louder. They started speaking towards the preacher a little bit louder. They started raising their tone in the songs a little bit louder so that his disruption was drowned out by Christians supporting one another. And eventually he backed away. The only scary moment was when you saw how dark it gets in there. And behind me there, it's complete pitch dark. There was one night Gary Knuckles was preaching, and this guy just comes out of the darkness, stumbling kind of weird, reaches for Gary's neck, and I was like, well, we've lost Gary. He's dead. We are watching a murder take place. And then I was like, why did I not move? I just sat here. Sorry, Gary. Sorry, buddy. Thankfully, they just grabbed him by the arm, took him aside. It was okay. But unusual to have those disruptions. But they did not disrupt the spirit of the Christians there, and it kind of went on. We started at our lowest point. We had 33 show up, and that was a little discouraging because we were used to more people showing up for these things. And we eventually got to about 70. It's really hard to count. And at one point, we're like, why are we even counting? How do you count? And why are we doing this? Because you would find that this is what you would see from the side. And then you would see a few people in the midst of the crowd. Then you would look back and you see people sitting to the side that we'd been talking to throughout the week. So that was kind of exciting that they were there. But then you would walk into the back of the cars and you would see more people sitting down, listening, paying attention. Then you'd walk back further and you would see people sitting in their cars listening. And it was just their way of kind of being there but not being there. So it became kind of hard to do that. But it grew and it grew and it grew. Now, we'd been to some islands where we were super happy to get 100 people to show up, but those islands had a population of 80,000 people. We had 70 people show up and a population of 5,000 people. That's a big difference. Percentage-wise, that is a massive difference. And as we closed out the night there, we got this beautiful, beautiful sun that was coming up. This is a young man Emma's talking to in this picture, and he had been studying hard, and it was laying heavy on him, super heavy on him. He didn't sleep a couple of nights in a row. He had not yet obeyed the gospel. He knew he needed to, but he was holding off on it, and he's holding off on it. And we're praying for him. And there was another guy who said, yeah, I know I've got to. So these people are not going to make knee-jerk reactions. And we're not going to go down there and do the kinds of studies where we're trying to get them to do knee-jerk reactions where they're not making the commitment to Christ for real, but just doing an emotional thing. It's got to be genuine, and it's got to be for real, and it's got to be a real commitment they're going to pursue. There's follow-up that's taken place. This is a beautiful sunset on our very last night. Can't believe that the sky looked in such a beautiful way. It darkened out some of the very, very ugly ferry ships and whatever. Just a matter of perspective and the way you look. But what a way for us to be blessed to have that on this trip. Throughout Glenn preaching the book of Acts, we could hear him a mile away, and nobody complained to us. In fact, as I told you before, the police said, we're glad you're here. The citizens said, we're glad you're here. People would come up and speak to us and say, thanks so much for teaching Jesus. Our island needs that. When we would get lost or look for a particular place, they said, let me walk you over there. And then they would show up at church in that evening service. It was a beautiful thing to see people care so much for trying to understand the Lord, to have that kind of a desire. Here we are leaving, packing up and heading out, walking up the road to load our cars up. And this is Mark Charles, the preacher I was telling you about, and his family. This is the week after we left. They're going back to do the follow-up work, to connect with the people that we had gave him their phone numbers and their information that said, we want to study the Bible. This is a guy who's going to do the follow-up work. We get those kinds of people that have that kind of desire and are pursuing God in that way. How could any church not grow? Whether it's here in Evansville, whether it's in Bequia, whether it's in any other state or any other country in the world, what matters is that we are the people that have that kind of desire. We started off by having a scripture reading with the Beatitudes. And sometimes it comes across as pretty common. But I want you to think about your desire for these things in the Beatitude. Where are you in your relationship with God? We traveled thousands of miles to go be with people this way just for 10 days. Just 10 days out of the year. But there's 355 days out of the year that we are here, and we are going to reach out into our community. There's a time where we reach out and look at one another, and we have to ask ourselves, is my desire, is my passion, is it truly for God? Listen to these in the Beatitudes. Follow along if you have them open in your Bible in Matthew chapter 5. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Do I desire to be the person that is poor in spirit and have the kingdom of heaven? Blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Do I desire to be meek? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst after righteousness. Do we hunger and thirst after righteousness? Do we have that desire in our heart? Blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. Do you have mercy? Do you desire mercy? Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers. These are choices for us to desire and build up in our lives. Do I want to be pure in heart? If so, let go of anything that would stain my heart or lead me away from it. Do I desire to be a peacemaker, or am I looking for a way to get vengeance or look for a way to tear somebody down? Or do I want to be a peacemaker so I could be called the Son of God? Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they revile and persecute you and say all kinds of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, for great is your reward in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. Do I desire, if it was necessary, would I stand up to the persecution? Ultimately, do I desire all these qualities that God's given? Do I desire to put my focus and perspective on God? Or do I desire to put it on the world? That is a choice that you have before you every single day. You're going to grab a hold of one. You're going to grab one, but God has let that be your choice. Your eternal destination is going to be determined by your passions. God has made it possible. You get to make the choice. Today, we're challenging you to think about what can take place in another country. And that joy and the passions that we've seen on this mission trip were incredible. This is one of my favorite mission trips I've ever gone on. And I've been going on them since 1996. I think I've gone 36 mission trips. This one was truly something special. You would think at some point it would get old and get common and get plain, but it just keeps getting better when the desire and the passion to draw closer to God is there. This is true not just for me, but for every single one of us. In whatever aspect that you're serving the church, does your desire increase? Make it happen. Make it happen. Next month, we're actually going to have a door-knocking campaign here in our community. We're going to start doing that far more often. Philip's helping organize that. That may be something that you say, hey, I can participate in that. I've asked him to have a 2-to-1 ratio from adults to kids, so he's going to need you to help participate in that. Join in that as well. Anything we do in the church, build up your desire, build up your passion, and make sure it's for God's glory. Today, if you're not even yet a Christian, we should talk about that. I can't go to another country and talk about the Bible if I can't do it right here at home. If you have a desire to draw closer to Jesus, if you have a desire to become a Christian, take a step. Make something happen. Let God be your desire. Come forward now as we stand and as we sing.